So backed by popular demand, this will be a simple presentation on Tencent. And for those of you who haven't catch it already, I've released a simple presentation on Alibaba a few weeks back. So with that, let's jump right into Tencent's business. And essentially, to understand Tencent's business model, you just need to know there's 4 specific arms: WeChat, online gaming, advertising, and the fintech and cloud computing arm. So now, if I were to pose a question to you guys, out of the 4 specific business segments that I've talked about, which arm do you think is the most important to Tencent? So before I reveal the answer, remember to just scroll down and just type in the comment section below. And of course, remember to help smash the like button as well. Help us get to 88 likes. Anyhow, to give you the simple answer, it's essentially just staring at you right in your face. You can look at this infographic in the presentation provided by Tencent and look at what is at the core of this entire business. Yes, WeChat and QQ, and both are social media platforms. And don't ask me why there are 2 different product offerings. QQ started first and then they morphed into WeChat, but I don't understand why people still stayed on QQ. But anyhow, I'll be providing more details as to how WeChat is going to enable the entire digital empire in the later part of this presentation. Now, moving on to understanding the capabilities of the different product offerings Tencent has to offer, it is essentially summed up in this slide. There are either number 1 or number 2. There is basically close to no competitors in China today. So this phenomenon is essentially the result of survival of the fittest. And that is why, in order for all these big tech firms to rise to the top, normal mere mortals like myself probably cannot comprehend the amount of challenges they have to circumvent in order to rise to the top, at least in the last 1 or 2 decades. So I'm not going to belabor the point. You guys can read on your own about the digital capabilities and prowess Tencent has in China today. But I think to re-emphasize the importance of WeChat, you can see that in the presentation and the slide deck, they're essentially singing the same tune. Communications and social, which is WeChat and QQ, essentially is the biggest gear. And this is the biggest enabler for the entire digital empire. When you move the big gear, all these small other gears will move alongside. Your gaming, your digital content, your fintech, your cloud, your utilities. And this is essentially the heart of the entire empire. But don't be mistaken about the wonders WeChat does bring to the entire Chinese community today. So I just wanted to include a small distinction between the different investment philosophies behind Alibaba and Tencent. So this is essentially a short extract that I got out from Financial Times, and I think it very much encompasses how the management think and how they deploy capital in order to integrate back into the business itself. So unlike domestic rival Alibaba, which often tries to acquire controlling stakes, Tencent prefers to remain a minority shareholder and avoids directly meddling in the management of the companies in which it invests in. So companies partly owned by Tencent that have gone public include Pinduoduo, an interactive e-commerce platform; Meituan, a leading food delivery service; and Singapore-headquartered Sea Limited, which operates online gaming, e-commerce, and digital finance services. And more importantly, back in China, I think it's also an open secret that Alibaba and Tencent are essentially arch enemies. It's extremely explicit. Just take the e-commerce industry for example. Alibaba is dominant since the start of time in China, and look at its 2 biggest competitors in the e-commerce industry today, namely JD and Pinduoduo. And surprise, surprise, Tencent actually do have a stake in both of those companies. Similarly, looking at the digital payment system, it's Alipay versus WeChat Pay. Flip over to cloud computing, it's Tencent Cloud versus Ali Cloud. So for those of you who think that competition is dead in China, maybe you might want to think again. But I think specifically in this extract, I just wanted to highlight the main differences in terms of how the management thinks. And when Alibaba does an acquiring, or when they do seed rounds and invest and do all these venture capital initiatives, they most probably want to integrate the business back into its core business. While Tencent, on the other hand, runs a huge investment portfolio, and some might say that it's pretty similar to SoftBank with the spray and pray approach. But I guess you can make your own decision, and I'll be discussing a little bit more about the investment portfolio in the later part. Now, moving on, specifically zooming into the most important aspect of Tencent's business, which is WeChat. So WeChat is essentially the lifeblood of China. If you want to fact check me on that, for those of you who dare to go to China today, you can book a ticket, fly over to China, and don't expect to come back so easily. But anyhow, just go onto the streets and just find any Chinese national. I'm 69% sure that they have WeChat on their mobile. And in the latest quarter, if my memory serves me right, I think WeChat is currently sitting at around 1.3 billion active users. So that's just essentially the scale of the app itself. Now, specifically pivoting over to the financial breakdown of Tencent alone, so I've actually drawn out the financial year 2021, that was reported back in Q4 of last year. So some of you might ask me, hey, why are you not looking at the latest quarter? Is it because Tencent has a negative revenue growth of 3% and you're not talking about it? I think more so because I wanted a more comprehensive result that actually shows the entire financial year rather than a snapshot of a quarter. And of course, we can always do an updated presentation after this year ends, and maybe I'll do an update again in March of 2023. So no qualms with that, so don't worry, I'm not trying to hide anything. But of course, in the last 2 quarters, I think both Alibaba and Tencent has produced extremely disappointing results, specifically because of the macro headwinds of zero COVID, perpetual lockdowns, weakening economy, people losing their jobs, etc, etc. But I think really to ground you into the perspectives of all the different bear arguments out there against all these Chinese tech companies, remember back when Ant was essentially rug pulled? That was back in August of 2020. And after that, there was a series of quote-unquote crackdowns and government regulations that many people claim that it destroyed the business. And 2021 was essentially the playground for regulators. And guess what? Alibaba grew top line by 19%, and Tencent on the other hand grew top line by 16% year on year. Then it really makes me wonder, what happened to the different draconian regulations to all these different companies? And I think more importantly, the macro headwinds are definitely a lot more concerning compared to quote-unquote draconian regulations. So now, back to the financial highlight. Like I mentioned previously, there are 4 specific arms. First is the social network, which is WeChat and QQ. Second is the gaming arm. Third is the advertising arm. And last is the fintech and cloud computing arm. So I think just to look at the year-on-year growth rates, I think social network, it's essentially a matured business. There is only that amount of people in China. So there is a cap in terms of the total addressable market. But that being said, I think the total addressable market is capped in terms of the number of users using WeChat platform itself, but the potential that WeChat is able to accrue to shareholders and to the entire business empire itself, that is scary, and the potential is pretty much limitless as long as China continues growing. Now, moving on to the gaming vertical itself, you can see that under the domestic games segment, it essentially came to a screeching halt because game approval was stopped. There was new introduction of regulations to kids, banning them from playing video games to 3 hours per week or something like that. On the flip side, people in the international community continues to get addicted to games, and Tencent continues to push out blockbusters after blockbusters. And we'll talk about the scale of their gaming vertical in a later part of the video. Next on, moving on to online advertising, they essentially faced a huge amount of headwind, especially on the crackdown of education, real estate, and those are the huge behemoths that are spending a huge ton of money on advertising. So essentially, you can look at the advertising arm of Tencent similar to probably Meta, where they are essentially running social media impression ad. And comparatively, if you were to compare it to the likes of probably Amazon or Google, those are much more search-based, and the state of the mind of the consumer is probably already in the buying phase. So it's easier for conversion. On the flip side, companies like Tencent, Meta, TikTok even, those product solutions are essentially just driving impression and probably brand awareness. So the effectiveness of those ads are borderline debatable, and when the economy is back, it's definitely the first to go. So I did briefly break down the advertising relationship between Alibaba versus Tencent in my Tencent earnings video. So if you guys are interested, feel free to visit that video after this. And last part, I think the fintech and the cloud computing business, it grew by quite a huge margin, but because the management lumped everything together, we don't really have a clear transparency on how the different arms are moving. Now, specifically zooming into Tencent's gaming business, you can see that all its competitors dwarf in comparison. And all these are big companies, by the way: Microsoft, Disney, Sony, NetEase, and Sea Limited. And this infographic really grounds you into the context of who's actually earning the big bucks in the industry, rather than just based on hearsay and your own personal anecdotes. So for context, Honor of King in Chinese is actually called 王者荣耀. I believe I do have quite a lot of friends that are playing this game, but personally, I've probably stopped playing all the video games, regardless if it's on mobile or on desktop, because somebody is not happy about it. But anyhow, just to give you context, Honor of Kings have over 200 million people playing it weekly, including over 55 million in China alone. And this is probably one of the highest grossing amount of revenue drivers for Tencent's gaming business. But that being said, Tencent's gaming business has a huge variety and it's hugely diversified. Now, I think to give you more perspective, I went to cheekily Google what is the most played mobile games in America today. And to my surprise, the first rank actually is Candy Crush Saga. So I don't know how many of you are still playing Candy Crush, but some of the key statistics that Candy Crush actually brought to King, which is the main company. So Candy Crush actually generated $1.2 billion in 2021, making it the 7th highest grossing game title. And there is a whopping 273 million people playing Candy Crush once a month. So the monthly active users peaked in 2015 with 327 million users and 273 million people playing Candy Crush once a month. And here you have Wang Zherongyao, or Honor of Kings, having 200 million people playing it weekly. And just looking at the revenue Candy Crush is driving for the company itself, Candy Crush's parent company is actually King. And as you can see in the infographic itself, King is actually acquired by Activision Blizzard, and currently there are speculations that Activision Blizzard is going to be acquired by Microsoft. I'm not too sure whether the regulators are going to allow it or not. But just looking at this 7th highest grossing game title, it's part of this $2.6 billion. And Tencent on the other hand is $32.9 billion. Let that sink in for a while. And for investors or commentators out there that like to do meaningless comparison, maybe try to gain some global perspective first before trying to make bold claims. Now, pivoting over to Tencent's advertising business, it's essentially a disaster. I'm not going to belabor the point. I think in the latest quarter, in Q2 of 2022, they are down 18% year on year. And mostly, it's probably reflecting the notable weakness in the internet service, education, and finance sector. And these are usually the high-paying CPM industries. And per conversion, it's usually a high-ticket item as well. So if China is going to expect a slowdown, the advertising business is going to be hit disproportionately. So that's just a given. It's a cyclical nature that models after the economic growth and the prospects of the economy. Now, I think for cloud, it's also a tricky topic for many investors. Currently, you can see that based on 2021 infrastructure services spending, Tencent is ranked third behind Huawei and Alibaba. But we all know of the great potential the China cloud market has to provide, and this is based on Alibaba's own projection. And you can see how underpenetrated so many of the industries are. However, that said, if you were to really compare, in FY 2021, the fintech and business services, which is the cloud computing inclusive, it grew 34% year on year. But in the latest quarter, it essentially shrunk by negative 1.3% year on year. So this is definitely worrying news, especially for investors that bought into it thinking that it's a cloud play. But I think ultimately buying to Tencent or Alibaba for that matter is a bet on China. It's not really anything else. You definitely do wish that the economy comes out stronger. These kind of companies, Tencent and Alibaba, providing the basic infrastructure of the entire economy, will appreciate alongside. So that's just your bet. Now, moving on to Tencent's investment portfolio, I think these are the bigger names out there like Meituan, Sea Limited, they sold a little bit of Sea. JD, they gave it all out to as a special dividend to shareholders. Pinduoduo, Tesla, Epic Games, WeBank, Snapchat, etc., etc. So I think this is also a huge black box for retail investors. We probably don't have a lot of transparency in how they deploy their capital. But I think if you were to really look at the past performance and the history of management team deploying capital, they have done a fairly good job in terms of their investment portfolio. So if you guys believe in their capital allocation skills, then yeah, this is essentially just an additional upside for shareholders. And just some perspective into the scale of their investment. So Tencent Investment was the most active Chinese venture capital firm in the first quarter, with 103 international deals, spending more than RMB 60 billion, which is 9.2 billion USD, and around 30% of its target were game developers, suggesting that Tencent invested in a game company every 3 days in Q1. And just some context, this is back in 2021, when the so-called draconian regulations are in process. So just some perspective as well, first quarter have 103 deals, one quarter has 90 days. So that's 1 point something deal every single day. But I think one point to take note is there's a great deal of uncertainty ahead. So a tweet from Rui Ma, probably quite respected in the Chinese tech and analysis space. So just saw an article claiming that Tencent had made 260 investments in the first half of 2021, but just 56 in the first half of 2022. It's still a leading investor, but has slowed down a lot since last year. So I will guess it is due to the uncertain business conditions or opportunities as much as or even more than regulations. So ultimately, I think the bottom line is simple. I think these so-called draconian regulations are not as scary as how the media, all these genius YouTubers are putting it out. I think the biggest overhang still lies on the underlying performance of the economy itself. And if the economy is doing great, these businesses will probably flourish. And I think just a last point to note, because I realized that I didn't cover why WeChat is important, just to give you a very high level breakdown of what WeChat does. With their 1.3 billion active users on their platforms every single day, the amount of data Tencent harvests on a daily basis is just incomprehensible. So the competitive advantage of the digital empire Tencent has created is basically this aggregation of data. With the amount of data they have, they can understand in real time the changing in consumer tastes and preferences in China today. They can understand what are people worried about, they can understand what are people interested about, and then thereafter, many of the business arms, for example, in the gaming business, they can understand that maybe, for example, hey, there is a huge increase in interest in playing ancient related games like 三国演义, Three Kingdoms, etc. They can come out with a Three Kingdoms game and they can essentially just funnel this game through their social media platform. And that's just how incredible this funnel is. And you can just look at this 1.3 billion people that is at the disposal of Tencent as the biggest moat that any company can probably ever have. In the same vein, they're able to harvest the data and try to predict what are the different problems that the different industry faces. And many a times, many of their portfolio companies that they invest in are just trying to catch this next trend moving forward. And that's how they're able to generate such a huge amount of return. And I guess that's just how crazy the entire business model Tencent managed to acquire and build in the last 2 decades or so. So I do hope that you enjoyed this simple presentation on Tencent, and I'll see you in the next video. But more importantly, I will see you on the moon. Goodbye!